As a young pianist, I'm just gonna call it pianist, I was clueless to all this talk about the grid and quantizing. Didn't know what that was either, and how it was ruining music. Maybe I just have a weird perspective because of my classical background and the fact that I got into recording and producing later in life, because it seems to me that a lot of the conversation surrounding this topic acknowledges that there is a problem, but often looks in the wrong places for solutions or ways to address it. So today, I just want to examine the way that I've addressed this in my own music and see if we can use my weird perspective of having two careers, basically, and apply that to help make our music feel less mechanical if that's our intention. And that's a big key as well. As a kid, I must confess I didn't fully understand why I had to spend all this time practicing scales and arpeggios and difficult passages with a metronome. I guess from a technical perspective, it did make sense. I mean, you had to be able to play things cleanly and evenly at a slow tempo before you progressively increased the tempo so that you could play these impressive virtuosic passages. I would find when I worked a passage with a metronome that it would become rigid after I got it up to tempo. And then it seemed like my teacher would have to work backwards with me to get that sort of mechanical aspect out of my playing. So my thought was, well, why not just let me skip that step? I mean, especially if I can play all of the notes in a passage. But the funny thing was, years and decades later, I found myself teaching my own piano students the exact same way. So why? When I got to college, one of my piano teachers explained it to me in a way that stuck with me and made perfect sense, and things kind of clicked for me, pun intended. She said musical timing and expressiveness is like a bank account. You cannot withdraw more than you put in, unless you do the Chase money glitch, apparently. Or as I went on to explain it to my own students down the line, it's like a rubber band. You can stretch it, you can let it retract, you allow it to relax, but you can never add or take away from the length of the rubber band. So that's where counting comes into play. We have to take the time to install that structure, but then we can be more flexible and make things more human. So I'm never abandoning the structure. We start from a place of structure and then allow ourselves to be expressive within that structure without throwing away the structure completely, which is what a lot of young piano students want to do. They want to just ignore that for the sake of being expressive. And it's something I've also noticed in some less experienced electronic musicians as well. A lot of times what we perceive as expressiveness or breaking out of the grid kind of just becomes untethered, meandering nonsense. And I think this is the main issue for people who maybe have not played a traditional instrument and have just been using their laptop and just dragging things around using the grid as a tool, which it is. It can lead to me, what is the most unnatural feeling things, even more than a tightly quantized loop or something, is when it feels like someone has tried to manufacture expression. It's the stuff that was clearly made in loops on the grid with a mouse, but then it's forced to feel natural by clicking the tempo track and kind of randomizing it in ways that may not make a lot of sense. And that doesn't feel more human, it feels forced. Going back to the rubber band analogy, when I play a musical phrase, I have a physical connection to it. And I look at it not as a bunch of individual notes or chords, but as one connected phrase. So the beginning of the phrase is tethered to the end of the phrase. It's connected just like that rubber band. It's really all about how one note connects or tethers to the next, and the next, and the next, and then how that whole arc connects together as one musical thought. This is one of the reasons why I champion playing an instrument that isn't just a laptop. Boomer take, maybe, but I don't think that's an experience that you get any other way than being tactile with an instrument. It's certainly not an experience that I've ever gotten clicking around entering MIDI notes into a grid. But even if you aren't proficient with an instrument, you can still be aware of this and think about your phrases in this way. And you can manufacture expression in a more natural feeling way just by zooming out and thinking about phrases as a whole rather than note to note. Now, in terms of effectiveness, this far outweighs micro timing every step in a sequence, a little to the left, a little to the right, and convincing yourself that that makes a huge difference. Sometimes maybe it does in a beat or a groove. Most of the time, it's kind of placebo, in my opinion. And if you get too carried away with it and exaggerate those things, it just starts to feel forced and unnatural. I've had equally strong emotional experiences or reactions to music both performed on traditional instruments and to music programmed into a sequencer. Both can be incredibly effective. If you've listened to my music in the past, not that I presume you have, you'll notice that I like to combine those two elements and play with improvising or playing around a fixed sequence. I think classically minded musicians such as myself can learn a lot from electronic music, because I've heard a lot of classical musicians that get incredibly wishy-washy with their timing beyond what I think the composer probably intended. In fact, I think it was Debussy that used to complain about people over-exaggerating the expressiveness in his music. I'm paraphrasing here based on my memory, so may not be factually accurate. If only we had a way to research these things. But I believe he said something along the lines of, I wrote it the way I wanted you to play it. Like it's in there. If I want you to take time, I'll indicate it. Don't just add stuff arbitrarily, because it kind of breaks down the overall structure of what Debussy intended the piece to be. Last year, a very talented high school choir came and performed a concert at the church where I played the organ. They sounded great. The director had done a great job getting a good sound out of them, which is an art unto itself if you know anything about choral music. But the director took so many wild, unmusical liberties with the piece that it was hard to stay engaged. Every single phrase felt like the beginning and the end of a new piece. So when we do something every time, it totally devalues those moments that we could save it for, the impact that it could have if we didn't do it every time. It's like watching a video where someone says the F word every other word, and it's like, well, I don't even hear it anymore. It has no impact. Whereas if I said the F word, you would perk up and be like, he doesn't say that very often. I mean, I try to reserve it for stepping on Legos. I realize this doesn't get as many clicks, but the whole point of this is that there's nuance to this discussion. When I record one of my solo piano pieces, or if I record playing with a small ensemble of string players or something, I don't use a click track. I use nonverbal communication and head cues, breath, things like that to communicate expressiveness with the other musicians. When I program a synth sequence or use my modular, it's tightly quantized to the grid. I mean, it's clocked. That's just the way it is. There is one specific technique that I found really useful, since I do like trying to blend those two worlds, and that's something in the classical world we would call the written out ritardando. Ritardando just means gradually slowing over time. And a lot of times composers will leave this up to interpretation by the performer, but often they'll actually write it out for us in longer note values. So if it's eighth notes, as we get to the end of the phrase, they may start writing in quarters. Quarters might become halves, and so on. And this is what I meant by starting from a position of structure and then implementing expressiveness, because they aren't changing the tempo, they aren't changing the BPM. Instead, they're just changing the rhythmic values of the notes to give the impression that things are gradually slowing down, and they are. And this translates incredibly well if you were, improvising alongside a clocked sequence, something tightly quantized to the grid. but then still want to give the illusion that expressive things are happening. If there's a gradual slowdown or a gradual speeding up, you can do that just by doing the sort of written out expressiveness. And of course, written down could also mean programmed intentionally in your DAW. So when I'm performing or conducting a piece written by someone else, my first thought is sort of the Hippocratic Oath, right? Do no harm. And in this case, do no harm to the composer's intent, which they usually indicate to you in the score. So what's the point of that? Well, we can apply that sort of intention to our own work as well. Save those moments where you want there to be expressiveness for an impactful moment. Find where your climax is and use expressiveness there. But also zoom out and think about bigger picture things rather than just grabbing that tempo track, moving it around, or letting Ableton randomize it in some sort of way that's supposed to make it feel more human. 9 times out of 10, you won't be able to really tell much of a difference there, but if you think about big phrases, bigger picture, sections, how they relate within the piece as a whole, or the track as a whole, those are the things that are going to have the biggest impact in making your music feel more expressive and deliver the emotional impact that I know it can have. So first, what is my intent? What do I want this music to do? And how do I want it to make people feel? Once we've answered those questions, we can start to address how we want to convey that as effectively as possible. I've taken a couple decades of experience sort of combining these two worlds of the more traditional side and electronic music, and put them in a free composition guide ebook for you down below in the description if you would like to check that out. A lot of people have downloaded it and found it helpful. You can also click this rectangle right here to watch me talk more about composition and arrangement and all of those good things.